were waiting for one of the speakers, actually quite important speaker for the event happening today. So I'm Freya, I work at Parasite. Welcome here today. And tonight is a very special event for Parasite that we are announcing the naming of our education room to a late Hong Kong artist, Antonio Mak. And this beautiful encounter comes from a private donation contribution to support the programs that will host at this education room in the next 2 years. And this contribution would like to dedicate this special event to a Hong Kong artist. And that responsibility falls on the shoulder of two of our founding members, Sara, who's on the way here today, and Warren. And they decided to dedicate it to Antonio Mak. Please come. There's a couple. You can feel free to sit in the front. So this dedication make Parasite a bit closer to Antonio. As you may know, that he passed away in a very young age at 43 in 1994. That was before Parasite established. And we found extremely honored to have this opportunity to get closer to Antonio because of the naming. And so we felt it would be a great opportunity to invite some friends here tonight to share not only the legacy of Mak to people who already know him, and also to people like me from a different generation and who didn't grow and study in Hong Kong. We have the opportunity to know more about Mak. And so I hope that tonight we'll just begin with a first step to reintroduce Antonio's legacy to the audience. And there's another exciting news besides the naming of tonight is there is a publication, oncoming publication is going out is with the support of the State of Antonio Mak and MCCM, which Win is here with us today, and Hong Kong University Museum and Art Gallery. They're working on this book about the drawings of Mak, which will be published in October this year. So this is a very exciting moment. And I think without further ado, let me introduce friends are here with the guests with here tonight. We have Sara is on the way. We have Kurt Chen, who is a study after Mak for a short period of time. And I was told that you're more or less the contemporary Antonio Mak. So I think there is there is no one better than you to be here with it today. You would talk more about how your followers and his practice influenced you. And also we have David Clark. David wrote a substantial essay, an interview with Mak, and was published during the time 1993-1994 when Mak was still in good health, and then it was published in 1995 together with Oscar Ho, and the book that he just passed, and then was part of the essay was included. And then we have Jaffa here with us. And 10 years ago in 2008, Valerie Doran curated shows called Looking for Antonio Mak in Hong Kong Museum of Art, which featuring 8 Hong Kong artists to respond on the works of Mak. And Jaffa is one of the artists there. Valerie was supposed to join us tonight, but she's unfortunately couldn't come back from the States. She prepares hundreds of images of slides of the show, and then a short text, which I will read on behalf of her later. And Jaffa, of course, will tell us a little bit about her contribution at the exhibition. And she also brought one of her collections of Antonio's work, which we will elaborate more. And then it's another beautiful surprise with Lo Jin. Sorry for my Chinese accent. Lo found out our event days ago and reconnected with Sara. And he told Sara that he is actually working on a documentary about Antonio. And there is a beautiful stories back then, which it took almost like decades putting the storage in, and now it's reopened. And she's very generous tonight, is showing some of the clips with ongoing editing clips to us later. Yes, so it's gonna be very exciting, and I know there's a lot of friends right here knows more about Mark than probably us do. And so we will open Q&A later on, so feel free to share your memories with Mark with us later. And so now I'll pass the mic to Kurt.
Thank you for Freya's introduction. Actually, my encounter with Mac is very brief because when I was studying in Chinese university for the first year, he was one of the artists that taught me drawing in the drawing class. And by that time, he's very special. One of the reasons is there are not many fresh graduated from UK or overseas come back to Hong Kong to teach art, especially in Chinese U, because Chinese U at that time is the only institution that offer program in fine art studio studies. And actually, I was just one of the students in the class. I don't speak that much to him, but his appearance is quite, I would say, remarkable. One of the things is his way of his way of dressing is very, very, very special because he always dressed in white shirt, white trousers, but his trousers is always very messed with paints, but his white shirt is very clean. So I always think that, okay, this is maybe a trademark for an artist, showing that, okay, he has a very decent side of keeping the shirt very well white, but at the same time showing that he is working in the studio all the time. This is one thing that I thought, okay, maybe artists should build up their own image, and this is the first branding exercise that I got when I was a student. I'm not so sure whether he do it deliberately or I don't know whether it's an intentional act. But anyhow, I think being an artist, you got to make yourself special, but at the same time, you better have some substance. Not just look like an artist, but you behave like something else. Obviously, by that time, I didn't able to see many of his work because by that time he didn't show any. But the way he teaches is very different from the rest of the teacher. Hello, Sara.
Is that count as an issue?
Okay. The thing is, in the year one, by the year of 1979, I was a first-year student in the department, and the drawing class is almost like a foundation thing. And I expected like drawing class should be like drawing some plaster replica of some Greek sculpture. And I expect, normally the teacher would told us how to draw according to some analysis, structural analysis first, and then using the shades to represent some three-dimensional quality of the object. But his way is very different. He told us just to use line drawing and drawing from actually it's a full-size sculpture, from the feet to the head, not from the head. Normally we will always attracted by the head first. If you have a human being that is the subject of your own creation or exercise, you always put a lot of tension on the head because you're so worried about whether your final work could be accurate enough or really looks like the object that you see in front of you. But this actually altered my way of looking at things. But of course, by that time, I really don't understand why we should do that. But the way of observation actually make me, of course, nowadays when I look back, I try to understand what he's trying to do is to let us to see the negative space and the positive space at the same time, and try to relate the spatial relation between lines. And the other thing is only concentrate on the lines is basically enough for him. But by that time, of course, I would say none of my classmates understand his intention. We just think that he's a weird guy and want to do things differently. The interesting thing is that he never explained, but he always have a very, critical mind, always, especially not necessarily very harsh on the student, but very harsh on his contemporary artists. Talk about, this artist is very famous, but he's just a joke, like something like that. After saying all this, I think he's a very special teacher. He only taught around 2 semesters in Chinese U, and after that he just left the department. And by that time he's only a part-time teacher. I think he's newly grad from the UK and have tried to find a job and understand the teaching opportunity in Hong Kong. And unfortunately, by that time only Chinese U is the only institution that offer formal studio training in fine art. So I think he experienced that teaching very short period of time of teaching, and then he left and do something else. And I remember after that, I just keep knowing some, listening, wearing some news basically from Taiwan, and he told me once that Taiwan is more a reasonable place, especially in a year of early 90s or even in the late 80s. This is the only place that he thinks that he can find someone who can really understand his art. And later on, when the Modern Art Museum in Taipei was established, I saw his own sculpture of life size being exhibited there. And the other thing is, I would like to say is by that time he's actually the idol of the generation artists of my time, because by that time I think not only him, also Josh Hong, Han Wei-hong, Chao Yan-ji, even I think Gong Ji-sing is a little bit later, becomes the very prominent artist that inspired the next generation of artists, and actually lay down a ground that, okay, what artists should really looks like. And because of by that time, the gallery system is not that, or even the museum is not quite, I would say, able to understand and accept contemporary art. So these guys actually joined together and do something in the rooftop of Fringe Club, and then inspire a lot of people. So Fringe Club Art Center becomes a very prominent gathering place for different artists, especially the younger ones, to try to learn from them apart from the formal curriculum from the university. So this is a very important way for these artists to commit in education in some other form, not necessarily go into the institution. And when we compare the decade by that time and what we do now, I think now even the art market becomes so institutionalized, and also the institution is quite strong, including the educational institution and also the art market. So I really feel nostalgic and found that by that time even the institutional force is not that powerful, but there are so many opportunities for the artists to initiate some project and start their own contribution in whatever form that they can think of, and to join hands to make something wonderful. So for me, Antonio Mark is a very remarkable person. Not only teach us art, but also he acts like an artist for us to, to look upon. And also, seeing from now, I think he did some consortium to make the art scene more vivid in a way that I would say at that time these people are so pure. I mean, never really think about market, whether they can sell their work. They just make the work by himself. I have some other things to say, but I think I stop now and then let my colleague to share what they think first.
First of all, I have to sincerely sorry about my being late because of rain. I think I actually didn't get educated by Antonio, but when I was studying and in fine arts, and also when I first graduated and started to do my own work, Antonio is already a very established artist and a very prominent figure in Hong Kong. And we always got influenced by him in many ways. I remember the time when he had this group show in Science University. Yes, Science University. He did the work in response to the space there, and the work he did is literally he dug a hole into the lawn and put the staircase downward, and then facing a mirror in a 45 angle degree. And that was like for a student who trained with traditional curriculum in fine arts, I feel fascinated by the way he make his work and the way he's look at space and sculpture, and how did he look into negative space as a sculptural form. And that is I think besides all his sculptural pieces, like freestanding sculptural pieces, this is the piece that influenced me a lot, and also influenced me on my future development on my of my career. And go back to the naming, I think we are really honored to be able to name him. To name this room after him. I think go back to when Parasite started, we find a lot of relevancy with his influence to us. When we got this generous support of a fund to run this education room, and the patron actually allowed us to name the room, and then we started to think that whoever is the important figure that influenced us through our pathway, and we came out, the first name is Antonio Mark. I think one relevant thing is we always consider when he did his project in his studio in Kennedy Row, I think. Yeah. When he once opened his studio and did a contemporary art show in his studio, and we always, when we are talking, we always consider that as the first artist-run space in Hong Kong for contemporary art. And and later on, and also the other thing I feel fascinating is about artists at that generation. We always found that, including Antonio, also Han Wei Hong, Kurt just mentioned, they do not just focus on visual art as their own medium, their main medium. They also explore on many other different forms of expressions. Performing arts is one thing they always they always like work with and also alongside with their visual art practice. At that time, we can see a lot of artists, they cross between different circles. They practice with a multidisciplinary way of practice. And that is also, I think, one very interesting thing occurred lately is that is the reason why I invite also Lo Ziying here. Lo Ziying is a long-time friend. Actually, I learned from him. He's an animation master. He did animation, and he's the pioneer figure in Hong Kong in promoting animation. And I learned from him when I was in my university age.
Everybody learns from him.
Yes. And then later I know that Kurt also.
I do.
So, yeah, and I mean, Lo is a longtime friend of Antonio as well, and they work together, they collaborate together. And this is the thing we really wanted to promote, collaboration between different discipline of art forms. And so with this kind of background, I think to name him is, to name this room after him is very relevant, yeah.
Okay, so I know things past the time to David. Do you need your book back?
Okay, yeah, I may want to show one or two images from the book, thanks. So when I try to think about the time of the story of Hong Kong art from the 1980s to now, and in a very simple way, I like to break down into three generations. So I would call that the Bohemian generation, and that's up to about 1995. And then I would call the next one the ADC generation. That's when actually government or taxpayers' money starts to become available for the arts, which was such a novelty. Up until that time, you want to do something, fine, you do it, but you know, it's up to you. You have to pay for it. You know, nobody's going to come and watch it. There's no way you can go and present it anyway. But after 1995, well, one of the institutions that came into existence was Parasite, actually. You know, that started exactly in that ADC money moment and many other art spaces in Hong Kong. So it's only then you really have the beginning of an infrastructure that actually sort of has stayed around. You know, things that happened before that time were either temporary events or else they were intended as long-term, but they never were because people ran out of money to pay for it in their own pockets. I'm thinking of, like, for example, there was an artist space called Quart. Yes. And that was really very interesting, but it died very soon, you know.
Also very vibrant, I think.
Yeah, yeah. But that's almost like another story. And then the third generation would be, the last few years would be the art market generation, you know, after Art Basel and all this sort of thing, all these big galleries coming to Hong Kong, and a commercial art infrastructure suddenly being incredibly big, you know. And that's, you know, to me, the least interesting in a way. That's a kind of time of normalization of the Hong Kong art world. So the most interesting phases are the first two, and the most interesting to me personally is the very first of what I'm calling the Bohemian one. And that's the one where Antonio Mak belonged. And in fact, he didn't even live to the ADC era, unfortunately. So as I'm saying, most things done in that era are much smaller in scale. The museums didn't care about contemporary art at all. We didn't call it contemporary art. And you just did it because you had to do it. So people did things because they were intensely motivated. Art was something you didn't ask why you would do it. You just did it because you had to do it. You know, obviously you did it. So it was often quite a private thing in a way, only a small art world compared to today. You know, any kind of art event, you would know everyone who was there because it was that small. You mentioned some names already. I think of other names like Wong Yang-kwai, Oscar Ho. Then there were other sort of circles, like the photographers. They were quite strong in their own way, like Wong Wo-bik. The photography circle had its own very specific and it's also a sort of generational thing, you can say. This is a generation of Hong Kong people who grew up with Hong Kong as their horizon. And that's how I would distinguish it from the previous generation, who often were the people who came from China or have much more sense of Chinese culture in a broader way. So really hard to see art, and that included Antonio's art. I mean, this is like a big theme that even now it's hard to see his art. And, you know, when Valerie did her show in, is it 2008? Yeah. I mean, the show is about looking for Antonio. Even in 2008, you had to kind of look to try and find where he was, because it's hard to find him. And it's always been that way. So even during his lifetime, you have rare opportunities to see his work in a public place. I remember the major show to me in a public venue was at the Art Center. That was the only place contemporary art was shown in about 1993. There was a show of Almond Chu and Antonio Mak Hin-yeung's work together. And that was quite an important one to me. And then the only really big showing of his work was, so unfortunately, the one that came after his very early death in 1995. There was a retrospective that really was very, very comprehensive. And that's when this book was produced as the catalogue. And there hasn't really been anything apart from Valerie's show since. So Valerie's show was different because it wasn't trying to showcase just his work. It was trying to look at how his work may relate to the practice of later artists as well. So it had a more complex kind of role. So I felt very close to that generation, that so-called, what I'm calling the Bohemian generation, partly because they all studied overseas, it seemed, partly because where would you be able to study in Hong Kong? You know, a few people could study at CUHK, but then no other real possibilities. And it's only really more recently you have the Hong Kong Art School set up, the Baptist Academy set up, and then as a response to that, CUHK expanding its program and everything like that. So I think that made it an interesting scene, because people had studied in Japan, they studied in France, they studied in the US, the UK, in his case in the UK at Goldsmiths, and then at did his MA at the Slade School. And so it actually, you had people with very different trainings coming back and starting a conversation together. And because I just arrived in 1986, I arrived from somewhere else. Of course, the difference was they were all from Hong Kong originally, but actually their trajectory is a little bit similar to mine, in that they're arriving back in the 1980s or sometimes the 1970s and trying to work out how you could make a foreign training make sense of art practice in Hong Kong. And so their problem and my problem was a similar problem. You know, certainly it took me a few years before I could find a way to connect to the space and understand what was going on here. But I felt the same was true of those artists of my generation then. You know, it took them a while to work out. Actually, going overseas to study is the easy part, you know. Like Xu Beihong or Lin Fengmian or whatever, they went overseas to study, and you just sit in your class in Paris and you do what everyone else is doing, and you know there's a proper structure of what you have to learn. Fine, and maybe you do really well. Maybe you get a work in exhibitions in a salon or something like that. Fine, but then when you come back home to China or Hong Kong, nobody's telling you, nothing in your training tells you what that training, how that training should be applied in this being for a Chinese artist returning to China in the 1920s or a Hong Kong artist returning to Hong Kong in the 1980s. It's completely down to you to work up what that meant. And it was an interesting debate, I think. And it took a while for people to work out how they're going to localize their practice. And in a way, to begin with, they weren't even really always localizing it. They just, of course, you naturally start off by just carrying on doing what you're doing already. Maybe it was quite interesting anyway. And sometimes I got the feeling that there were artists who were almost making art for an international audience that didn't even know that they exist. It's like as if they were waiting for some famous curator like Leo Castelli to knock on their studio door, which wasn't going to happen, you know. But the key time was when people forgot all that and they started to do something that was much more locally orientated. And then things started to make sense. Making art for a local audience, paradoxically, meant that they were making art that people obviously could be interested in too, you know. So that was the key thing. And I think you can put it down to one day in history where that transformation really started to happen. And of course, that day is the 4th of June, 1989. You know, that was an event in Beijing or in China, but it really started a sense of localism in Hong Kong, because in combination with the countdown towards the handover, people started to think about, well, maybe, you know, we're not going to have some smooth convergence with a modernizing China after all. It's going to be more complicated than that, and we've got to think about our own future with the a transition happening that we don't really have much say over. So I think that's what really galvanized the art. And I see that there with Antonio's work too, that although a lot of the themes of his art are there, if you go through year by year, a lot of he's very consistent in the kind of themes that interested him. The themes and the elements. By themes, I would mean things like binary oppositions. That's a kind of theme in a lot of his art. And language is something he liked to play with, or a 2D, 3D is a kind of theme that he wants to play with a lot. Like he often uses mirrors in his sculptures to introduce a two-dimensional surface within a three-dimensional work. And the elements that come back are horses, tigers, mirrors, steps, trees, ladders. Be careful, ladder. More about that later, probably. Books and the male body, particularly the male body. Those are themes that come back again and again. So rather than sort of moving from subject to subject, he plays with the same elements. And I like to think of that as thinking with things. Somehow the fact that he's always using the same elements enables him to move forward in his thinking. Like the famous British artist and poet of the Romantic era, William Blake, he says, "The fool who persists in his folly becomes wise." The problem is most of us don't persist, you know, so we don't really learn. But if you really carry on in a single direction, eventually you'll find out what things are. So the fact that he's really staying with similar elements and coming back to them, I think enables him to do what I would want to call thinking with things, trying to use objects to come up with ideas. Often it's the elements of his sculptures are usually fairly small, tabletop type sculptures, so they're manipulable. They're kind of objects you could move around. And somehow that's also tied up with this ability to play with things, think with things. It's a conceptual kind of art that he's involved with, but it's something more than just pure conceptual art as we normally think of it, because for me his art is tied to, on the one hand there's a conceptual side, on the other hand there is very much an interest in the craft of making, the traditional sculptural craft of making. And it's because he's involved in the craft that I think he can think through things. If you're just a conceptual artist, you move from one idea to another idea, but what's the connection? But if you're involved with physical craft and you're playing with materials, then you're thinking with the through the materials. And certain things can come from that. I'm not saying that purely conceptual art can't be productive, obviously it can, but a certain kind of productivity is only there if you're involved with actually playing with materials, thinking things through materials themselves. I'm thinking of there's a story about the painter and sculptor Degas. He was friends with the poet Mallarmé, and he used to write poems, and he complained to Mallarmé, "Oh, I have such great ideas for my poems, but then when I finally I finish the poem, it's not so good." What, you know? And Mallarmé says, "Well, you know, poems aren't made from ideas; they're made from words. You know, and in the same way, maybe art is not made from ideas; it's made from stuff, and that maybe has to apply to conceptual art too." So that's why I think Antonio is interesting. Is partly he's got this conceptual side, but he's also got this physical engagement with material side, and it's a very deep engagement because he casts his own sculpture, which a lot of sculptors don't do. Even very great sculptors don't do. And as regards this sort of turn towards local things, I'm going back to what the point was the bigger point I was trying to make. I think he all the way through he's involved with these same themes, the same materials, and same subject matter, but after a certain point, it starts to get more locally related. He starts to make references to things that are happening in the Hong Kong scene, political events and so forth. And that's all coming in the wake of June 4th, 89. It probably takes a year or two before that works its way through into his art. The first artists that I feel in Hong Kong, they really made a kind of breakthrough to local things, was Louis Chan. Just to give an example. He's from an earlier generation. And I feel these kind of artists who found the way through to something local, it's a very precious thing because it wasn't so easy to do. There was no template for it because Hong Kong, I mean, if Hong Kong was a place that was going to have decolonization, then there's a given template. The template is national narrative and national art, and there's lots of examples you can use to how to do that. But if Hong Kong has this very funny history that doesn't have any kind of template that you can use, you've got to find your own particular way to fabricate a kind of local story. And to me, the first artist who really did this was Louis Chan. And his way of doing it was to go towards the unconscious. He didn't worry about, oh, am I too Chinese or too Western or whatever. He just let his unconscious flow out into his art. So, yeah, just from random mark making, you could say, suddenly finding images and not caring, just let, you know, and what comes out inevitably will have something Hong Kong about it. This one was, I got this catalogue in Han Art Gallery, and he signed it for me, Louis Chan, and he wrote something on it. And then he started drawing on the images. So this is what he used to do on other people's images. He'd get an art magazine from the US, you know, Art News or Art in America, and he wasn't intimidated by, you know, these famous artists. He just started drawing, you know, finding hidden images in their images that made it his images. So that was his sort of way through to something local that moved him beyond being an artist in a kind of minority situation. But I'm mentioning him because I find Antonio's strategy is almost a reverse strategy. His strategy is to become very self-conscious, very ironic about everything. A lot of the artists who were famous in Hong Kong at that time, like Loy Shou Kwan or Wu Shizhuang, often their art was built around a East meets West kind of structure. There's something very Chinese, but there's something very Western, usually something from abstract expressionism or something like that, and something from ink painting, and you had to carefully sort of juggle or balance these two things together in the same work because you didn't want to seem too Westernized because that would be a failure, and you didn't want to seem too Chinese traditional because tradition is so powerful it could swallow you up and then you'd be nothing. So how do you balance the two? And in the balance between that East and the West, often anything to do with Hong Kong got lost. But for Antonio, what he did, instead of getting rid of that East and West thing, I think in a lot of his works he intensified it. So there's more and more of a binary structure in his works. So let me just, I'm talking a bit too long, but let me just look at a couple of examples where I find that the case. Yeah, so this one here is called Bible from Happy Valley. So it shows two of the themes of his art that he liked to come back to. One is horse, and the other is books. And it's a book on the back of a horse. And the horse is bronze, and the book is lead. So the book starts to look a bit like the wings of a winged horse, a mythological horse, a horse that could fly. Bible from Happy Valley, so it's a horse that flies to win a race, maybe, you know. But because its wings are made of lead, it's actually not going to get very far. So it's a sort of paradoxical object. So unlike those earlier generation artists where they're trying to take something binary and make them fit together in a yin-yang way, something Chinese, something Western, neatly going together. Here he's putting two things which really don't go together, and they clash and they work against each other. So on the one thing, you know, the inability to move, gravity seems to be a big theme that comes through in a number of his works. So I think this is not a work about people who bet on horses or something like that. I think it's some kind of comment on Hong Kong's situation of caught between two things, and, you know, one country, two systems, and all this sort of thing. And I think there's also, also another thing in his work is playing with language, which comes in through the title often, but not always through the title. So I think a book on a horse could be Ma Shang Shu, you know, immediately you lose. A book on a horse, or immediately lose. You know, so it's that kind of, or in English you could say, if you want to take a bet, you go to a bookie. A bookie is someone who keeps books on horses. That means he keeps records of all the horses and your bets and so forth. So, you know, all this kind of thing sort of comes up, I think. Just give one more example. The Last Tango with Tiger, this one.
Maybe
So
we can
this,
hold
I
the
think,
book
is really a
higher.
kind of...
Maybe hold the book a bit higher.
Last Tango with Tiger. This is 1993, I think, isn't it? Yeah. Yeah, 1993. So this is really during the, you know, the run-up to the handover. It's really during the period where, I mean, once the run-up to the handover starts with the joint declaration, but it's only after 89 that starts to become really problematic. And by 1993, you really feel the force of the gravity of 1997 starting to kick in. So I think it's fair to read it as somehow maybe about all these patriotic businessmen who suddenly, instead of getting OBEs, they now suddenly become friends of China, and there's the paradoxical opposites of billionaires who claim to love socialism, communism, you know, because they can see their vested interests there. So opposites dancing together, and how dangerous such a little dance would be. It's not a nice, happy East meets West, yin meets yang kind of meeting of opposites. It's a dangerous thing. So he takes something which has been an essentialized notion of China and the West, or opposites, or something like that, and he intensifies it further. So you become very aware of it, and you become aware of it as something that is liable to break down, and is something that you could read onto contemporary situations. So rather than just trying to transcend boundaries, he intensifies boundaries. So maybe that's enough for now. The essay I put in this book. Now I've given.
Yes,
a
that will
copy
be
to-
published on the Parasite's website, so
Okay, yeah.
people can read David's essays, was including the book. Yes. I think now it's a good time that I follow with Valerie, that David just mentioned the exhibition that Valerie curated in 2008 at Hong Kong Museum of Art. There is a curatorial statement from Valerie that asked me to read on behalf of her, but I think I would, because of the time, would not read the whole thing, but we will also publish it on our website. So if you're interested, you can look it into the text. Just go through it. Taking the work of Hong Kong artist Antonio Mak as a starting point, this exhibition utilized a multi-layered approach to examine the questions of where and how the art of this seminal Hong Kong artist exists today, physically, psychologically, and metaphorically, and of how our perceptions might be changed by re-encountering his art and his history in our own time. Antonio Mak's sculptures, paintings, and drawings have made deep and enduring impressions on many of those who have had the good fortune to encounter them. His figurative cast bronze works, visually evocative and beautifully crafted, present a uniquely Makian iconography that stylistically is ostensibly Western, yet that is also integrally Chinese in many of their interior references. He is also, in his sensibility and concerns, a quintessentially Hong Kong artist. Yet, inexplicably, in the years since Antonio died in 1994, his artworks had all but disappeared from the public arena in Hong Kong. In seeking to address the almost inexplicable circumstances of Antonio's long absence from public view, in this project we created multiple layers of presence. The first layer comprised a core exhibition of Antonio Mak's works from both public and private collections, sought out and borrowed from the variety of sources in Hong Kong and abroad. This core gallery display of Antonio's artwork was assembled within an installation specifically designed for his art, and in many ways emanating from it. With a small but dedicated team, including myself and my project managers, we gathered together more than 120 examples of Antonio's artworks, including sculptures, drawings, paintings, and poetic writings from both Hong Kong and overseas. Some came from local museum collections, and many from private collections here and overseas, including most significantly that of Antonio's widow, Susan Fong, who from her base in England generously loaned many substantial pieces. A number of pieces also came from some of his closest friends. Antonio's brother was also very supportive in sharing artifacts, insights, and memories of Antonio. One collector from the UK walked into the gallery on the last day of setup and handed us an important piece that she had originally said she could not lend to the show. She had flown in from England to deliver it by hand. The second layer of the exhibition, we commissioned the participations of 8 artists from different generations and working in a variety of media. This included Hong Kong artists Fung Ming-chin, Jaffa Lam, Li Man-san, Lo Ying-san, Simon Birch, Guang Shangji, and Kong Qi-sun, as well as Shanghai-based conceptual artist Wu Sanzhuan, all of whom were invited to create an installation reflecting their response to Antonio Mak's art and history. For the third layer of the exhibition, both private and institutional collectors of Antonio's works were invited to photograph the exact placement of his art within their own particular spaces on a given day in the year. The resulting photographic exhibition created a picture of a reality of precisely where and how Antonio Mak's works existed physically in the real world, in real time, outside the exhibition frame. We also created a special documentary display of artifacts that were more personal in nature, including a painting by Antonio's father, a graphic designer and talented ink painter, small experimental pieces by Antonio, booklets from previous exhibitions that Antonio had in Hong Kong during his lifetime, self-portraits, and two larger bronze sculptures, which for many years had resided in unusual venues, one in a lively bar and one formerly commissioned for a commercial building that had been...
Oh, sorry, that's my recording.
that had been languishing in a giant crate in the corporate warehouse for many years. In order to realize the high level of technical support, which I hope to achieve for this show, including lighting, sound, and exhibition design, on a very limited budget, our team entered into a partnership with the lighting and sound departments of the Hong Kong Academy of Performing Arts, who generously lent the expertise of their specialists, Chris Jones and Leo Chong, and the help of their graduate students for sound and lighting design and installation. We also had the support of many of other friends who helped us out above and beyond the call of duty on many levels, including many members of HKMA staff, out of love and respect for Antonio. Most importantly, the exhibition sought to create a site of many new meetings between Antonio's works and the Hong Kong public, between Antonio and individual Hong Kong artists, and between collective history and personal memory. This is Valerie's note. In the selection of images for this Parasite presentation, I have started with some photos that show the set of process at the Hong Kong Museum of Art, as this exhibition was in very possible way truly an intervention in the museum space, often pushing the museum policy to the limits, which is sometimes a very good strategy. Hong Kong Museum of Art staff gambling discussed the pros and cons of bringing a live tiger or horse into the museum for some purchase proposal, ran around gathering together over 100 metal police barriers for Guanshanzhi, considering possible way to allow Jaffa Lang to live at the museum for 2 months. In the end, this wasn't possible, but they let her take naps there and also work and entertain visitors in the dream studio. I think Jaffa will elaborate more later. Allowed us to put up the carpet and to completely reconfigure the gallery space, and had to fumigate the Li Mansans found wood to kill insects, among other things. This was all very much part of the process. So these are all the images that's provided by Valerie, and we can keep it, continue running, and at the same time, I would like to invite Jaffa to talk about your experience back then, maybe.